Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. In case you missed it, we just emerged from a week of some of the most intense Granite State debates we've seen in a long time. From dating lives being abruptly dragged into the mix in CD1 to incumbent Senator Jeanne Shaheen letting it rip in the Senate debate, we'll look back at a very combative week. And for analysis, we get to turn to our own John DeStaso. And John, you've been doing this for 40 years. How unique was that last week of debates?
I was very surprised, pleasantly so, that it was so contentious all the way through. The last one, perhaps less so than the first three. But I was surprised at the challengers, not so surprised at the challengers, but I was very surprised by the incumbents, many of them with big leads, if you believe the polling, really going after their challengers and with no holds barred. And I thought the folks who are still out there trying to decide got a very good, contrast on all four of those major races.
It's almost like that presidential debate between President Trump and Joe Biden kind of set the tone, lifted the lid a little bit, and everyone was a bit more comfortable with exchanges like that. So let's go to the governor's race first. Dan Feltes needing to basically throw and catch a Hail Mary. He did better, it's safe to say, in this debate than he did in the primary debate. Let's take a look at one of the big exchanges here.
So obviously everything isn't fine. We're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, and the folks of this state have done an incredible job. I know my opponent likes to invoke my name and this idea that we're against health care and all of this. At the end of the day, I'm one of the few Republican governors in the country that are actually fighting to keep the Affordable Care Act in the U.S. Supreme Court today. New Hampshire is on the lawsuit today, fighting to keep the Affordable Care Act. I'm one of only 4 or 5 Republican governors bucking the trend, because to throw that system out wouldn't make any sense. So it's actually happening today. I know Dan likes to make an easy political statement that sounds nice, but the facts are the facts.
Well, Governor, these are your own words. In 2016, when you ran for governor for the first time, you ran on a platform of repealing Obamacare. In fact, when you were asked why you support Donald Trump, you said, I support Donald Trump because he would finally actually end horrible programs like Obamacare. On the Executive Council, you voted in 2012 to turn down the Obamacare healthcare exchange, and in 2017, you cheerled the effort to repeal Obamacare without a replacement.
That's been a standard line of attack for a long time, John. It's not really clear that it's working. What can we learn from the fact that he's sticking with this? Is he really just trying to pull back as many Democrats as he can away from Governor Sununu?
I think so. I mean, the governor has the support of a fairly substantial amount of Democrats, and Dan Feltes is going to his base to try to rile them up. Health care is obviously a very big issue, not only statewide, but certainly within the Democratic Party. And he did have the governor a little bit on the defensive there, because the governor has said the things that Dan Feltes has said that he said, but at the same time, the governor did direct the Attorney General to get involved in the case that's going before the Supreme Court right after the election. The governor did say that since we do not have a replacement, that we need to defend the current law. So Dan Feltes' health care is a way for him to carry through his overall theme of trying to tie the governor to Donald Trump.
One of the things that blew up in a bad way for Senator Feltes from the primary debate was when he said, quote, I agree, when Andrew Volinsky said that he would commute the death sentence of convicted cop killer Michael Addison in Manchester. And then later, Senator Feltes said, no, what he was really saying was that he supports a commutation process, but then if he was governor, he would actually veto that if the Executive Council did it. He was given a chance to kind of clean this up in the debate, and here's what he had to say.
Tonight, will you please definitively answer that question? Would you commute his sentence, or would you allow him to be executed?
Well, I've been consistent. I've been consistent in supporting a commutation process moving forward, but I don't support a commutation petition right now. And also, in addition to that, I don't think this is something that should be politicized. Chris Sununu has politicized this. I don't think we should be politicizing the murder of a cop. And we need to move forward together.
He said he's been consistent, and he wouldn't commute his sentence, but at some point he needs to commute his sentence. That is the most inconsistent thing I've ever heard. I've stood with the family, and I got to tell you, when you can look in their eyes and say, we are not going to commute the sentence of a cop killer, absolutely unequivocally. And I understand Dan had one position when he was running in the Democrat primary, and now he has another position. That's politics. That is the definition of politics. Nope. I've been consistent 100% all the way through.
John, Manchester is home to a lot of Democratic votes, but they can tend to sometimes be parochial voters. So how badly could this hurt Dan Feltes in Manchester?
I think the key word there that you said earlier and Dan Feltes said is the word process. This is something where you don't want to get into the details of process. And, you know, people want to know, are you for it or are you against it? I don't think it's a good move for Dan Feltes to try to split that hair. The governor had a good point that Dan Feltes made that point during the primary. He is consistent, but it's really too much in the weeds, and I don't think it does Dan Feltes any good. If he's truly in favor of or opposed to commutation, he should have just said so from the beginning and gone with the consequences in the primary, and now have that not a confusing aspect of his campaign right now.
Let's move to the U.S. Senate debate and Jeanne Shaheen. First of all, wow. I think I would recommend, if anyone hasn't seen the John Graffer documentary, The Premier Primary, there's an interview in that with Jeanne Shaheen from the early 80s when it's activist Jeanne Shaheen, campaign manager Jeanne Shaheen. And she's not at a reserve. She's not the governor. She's not the senator. And there are just sort of these sparks flying off of her. You can see all the charisma that would come to bear in those future electoral races that she would win. And, John, we got to see those sparks make a return on Tuesday night.
It's true. I was really surprised. I remember that Jeanne Shaheen, to tell you the truth. When I first met her, she was handling Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign down in Portsmouth. And so we hadn't seen that for a while. I was surprised, given, if you believe the polling, she has a fairly large lead. And so, you know, the idea there is to just sort of defend. But she really went after Corky Messner on a variety of fronts. She tied him to President Trump. She said that he's questioned mask wearing. She said that he didn't disavow Trump's a suggestion that people drink disinfectants. He said that she was misrepresenting. But her overall demeanor was very feisty. Hadn't seen that for a while. Did see it back in the days when she was governor, but really not so much, at least up here. Maybe in Washington, but at least up here since she's been in the U.S. Senate.
And she's always been able to deploy that when she's needed to. You could tell Corky Messner thought he had a pretty good debate. There were some times when he tried to press the advantage, in particular when he thought he caught the senator on an issue on the travel ban. Let's take a listen.
Is that what you're suggesting after the shutdown of the travel ban?
I'm suggesting that they should have been quarantined when they came back to the United States.
No, that is un-America.
If you watched 60 Minutes on
the 40,000 people were left back in. You wanted to keep Americans out of this country?
I wanted them quarantined to make sure that they were not bringing coronavirus back to the United States.
People back to this
30 seconds. 30 seconds for Senator Shaheen.
That was the problem. The problem was that people came in and there was no guarantee that they weren't infected. One of the reasons that we saw the spread of the coronavirus was because there were not consistent measures put in place, which is what we need in order to get ahead of this pandemic.
And, John, I know we were surprised when we got a bit more combative Senator Shaheen. Do you think Corky Messner might have been taken aback a little bit that she was like that with him as well?
Well, I think that they were, but I think Messner had some good moments. He certainly did have, he was on the offensive. I thought that was a good exchange for him. There was another exchange regarding the, foreign policy and troops and what she really said or didn't say about the number of troops in the Mideast. So I think Messner had a good debate. I don't think that he can come away feeling like he left anything on the table here. And but did he expect her to fight back like that? I mean, probably not. Probably not.
Now, if you thought the Senate debate was explosive, guess what? CD1 came along the next day and just kind of blew it away. John, this was one of those feel-the-room debates. Unfortunately, we didn't have an audience, but this was very much being in the room with those two candidates. It reminded me a lot of the Carol Shea Porter, Frank Ginta debates as they went on through the years. You could just feel the animosity in the room as it built there. Let's start with one of the exchanges so viewers can get a sense of the back and forth.
So I'll stand up to the special interests in Washington who like to get these, specialized breaks. Matt Mowers is the special interest because he has cashed in after he left the White House. He's working for the big drug companies and D.C. lobbying firms. He's not representing the people of New Hampshire.
It's not true, Congressman. Why don't we start on talking about tax policy? The fact of the matter is that Congressman Pappas is supporting a tax hike in Washington, D.C. right now. He has an opportunity, if he wants to, get off this stage, go down to D.C., take his name off the bill that would raise taxes on the middle income Americans, but he's chosen not to. So we've seen that. In fact, Governor Sununu and I are going to protect the New Hampshire way.
There's one thing I'd like you to break down here, John. Matt Mowers is running kind of under the wing of Chris Sununu, but he's also taking a very aggressive tone here as well. You got a lot of those swing voters in that southern tier in CD1. They're with Governor Sununu, seemingly. Will they buy in with Mowers with his demeanor being so different from the governor's?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the base, he is certainly the sort of aggressive, feisty, young conservative that will play well with them. In terms of those very important middle ground people, that's going to be more of a challenge for him. Chris Pappas is kind of laid back. He says he's just not as aggressive. But in this case, he was really on the defensive by Mowers, and you know, the exchange, we shall see. But I think that it sort of reminded me of the first Trump-Biden debate in a way. I think he might have taken a page from that to just speak over Pappas, to keep saying, "Oh, come on," that sort of thing, and you know, shake his head, et cetera, et cetera. It was a very interesting debate.
Yeah, Pappas had his moments of interruption, though, too. Let's take a look at another tussle between these two on health care.
I think about people that I meet each and every day that have a pre-existing condition. 570,000 people in New Hampshire with a pre-existing condition. They would be left without protection if the effort that my opponent supports succeeds to strip away the Affordable Care Act. So that's why we need someone who's been walking the walk on this issue, as I've been doing the last couple years. I'll stand up for the health care of the people of this country. Matt Mowers stands with the special interests and the insurance companies.
See, that's just not true. Once again, Congressman Pappas has taken a page out of the D.C. playbook. I've said consistently that I will always support protecting those with pre-existing conditions. Congressman Pappas wants to keep trying to lie about everything on this side. You know, Congressman, you want to rewrite your record, that's fine, but don't try to rewrite my statements. Fact of the matter is that I support ensuring that we have expanded health care access. We need to protect those with pre-existing conditions, but we need to do it in a way that's affordable. Congressman, you support efforts that would actually
what is your plan to protect people with pre-existing conditions?
Congressman,
you don't have one.
I absolutely do. Congressman, look, this is the petty politics that might go well on the House floor down there, but don't bring them here to New Hampshire.
Of course, right after this was when Matt Mowers announced to everyone that Chris Pappas was dating a corporate lobbyist and suggested there was something untoward about that. Pappas said this was out of bounds in the moment, and then followed up with that post-debate with an avalanche of pushback that included bringing the Human Rights Campaign into this as well, insinuating that that attack was somehow homophobic. John, for starters, setting that aside, was there any wrongdoing by Chris Pappas, any violation of law or congressional rule by dating someone like this?
No, there was not. There was not. And you know, I don't know exactly, and I've asked Mr. Mowers about this. What exactly did he want Chris Pappas to do, to disclose? Was he supposed to make an announcement? You know, I just think that it was, I think Matt Mowers needed to have more solid facts about what he was charging was wrong, about what Chris Pappas did by having, you know, a relationship with a lobbyist and not making an announcement about it, because there was no requirement that he needed to do that.
Yeah, certainly we're going to see how this one ends up landing with voters. Let's move on to the 2nd Congressional District. And John, let's start by watching what I thought was one of the more telling moments of this debate when Steve Negron was just hammering away on the issue of qualified immunity, and Custer did something interesting. Let's take a look.
You need qualified immunity because you need law enforcement in this state. And that's why I received the New Hampshire Police Association's endorsement, because you've abandoned them. And they realize that. And that's not who we are. And for once, we need to stand up and say that is not going to happen in the great state of New Hampshire. It's going to knock on our door, and we need the police to protect us. And by your stance on qualified immunity, it's clear that you've abandoned law enforcement, and that's why they're endorsing me.
Congresswoman?
No, I just wondered if he was going to answer the question she asked, so I'm good.
John, what this tells me is that even though this race is within the margin of error on the UNH poll, it looks like Congresswoman Custer might have some polling of her own, and she thinks this race is not close.
I agree with that. I think that they think that the race is not close, and we could see that. It was a good debate, though. There was a lot of good issues. This one was, you know, obviously more subdued, but there was a lot of good back and forth. I think that was probably the most feisty exchange. And, you know, Negron has done well, but Annie Custer defended her ground effectively, and did point out pieces of legislation that she supported and initiatives that she's taken. And I thought I was surprised, last thing is that Negron did not try to tie her more to, you know, the squad, Nancy Pelosi. There was not too much of that. I expected that to come out of his mouth pretty much every answer.
Yeah, and certainly Congresswoman Custer's been doing these Granite State debates dating back to 2010. She's very much in her element there. John, thank you so much for your analysis and all the great questions in the last week. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Adam.